For more than a decade, millions of viewers knew Ed O'Neill as Al Bundy, the exhausted shoe salesman, frustrated husband, and perpetually unlucky father who seemed to have one complaint for every problem life could throw at him. To many fans, Al was simply a sitcom character, loud, sarcastic, broke, unlucky, and somehow still standing after everything the Bundy family put him through. But there was another story happening behind the jokes. When Ed O'Neill later reflected on Married with Children, he offered something more interesting than another nostalgic look at a classic sitcom. His memories help explain why the show worked in the first place, why Al Bundy became so much more complicated than the character initially appeared to be, and why the series could never have been the same without O'Neill at its center. The most fascinating part is that many viewers misunderstood what they were actually watching. They thought Married with Children was simply a crude comedy about a dysfunctional family. But O'Neill's own recollections show that the series was built around something much more recognizable: frustration. Al wasn't a successful man pretending to be miserable. He was an ordinary man who had spent years imagining that life would turn out differently. That distinction changed everything. And perhaps that is the secret most fans never figured out. When people look back at Married with Children today, it is almost impossible to imagine anyone other than Ed O'Neill playing Al Bundy. But O'Neill did not immediately embrace the idea. Before television fame, he had spent years pursuing acting through theater and smaller screen roles. He was not yet the instantly recognizable television star that audiences would later know. According to the Television Academy's interview archive, O'Neill discussed how the premise of Married with Children was initially presented to him and how he originally passed on the show. That detail is important because it changes the way we understand Al Bundy. O'Neill wasn't desperately chasing the opportunity to become a sitcom father. He had already developed an identity as a serious actor. Then came a project that, on paper, sounded almost like the opposite of the kind of prestige role an actor might want. The premise was deliberately abrasive. A married couple had children. They weren't wealthy. They weren't glamorous. They weren't living the dream advertised by traditional television sitcoms. They were tired. They argued. They complained. They embarrassed each other. And they kept going. That was the joke. But O'Neill eventually understood that there was something beneath the joke. Al Bundy wasn't supposed to be a perfect father. He wasn't even supposed to be particularly successful. He was the kind of man who believed that his best years had happened long ago and that nobody around him seemed particularly interested in letting him forget it. That became the character's emotional engine. Al had once been a high school football hero. His greatest athletic achievement was something he constantly referenced. His glory days were always behind him, and his present life was full of bills, responsibility, family arguments, and a job he didn't love. That was why the character's complaints were funny. They weren't completely ridiculous. They were exaggerated versions of ordinary frustrations. And Ed O'Neill understood that. The first Married with Children pilot was not exactly the version audiences eventually came to know. The pilot originally featured Tina Casberry as Kelly Bundy and Hunter Carson as Bud Bundy. Before the series aired, the roles were recast, and the scenes involving the children were res-hot with Christina Applegate and David Faustino. That change may seem like a minor piece of television trivia. It wasn't. The chemistry between the actors became one of the most important ingredients in the show's identity. Christina Applegate brought Kelly a combination of innocence, confidence, vanity, and comic timing that made the character much more than a simple stereotype. David Faustino's Bud provided a different energy, allowing Al to have a relationship that was simultaneously competitive, affectionate, irritated, and strangely loyal. And at the center was O'Neill. The Bundys worked because the audience believed these people had been stuck with one another for years. That was the uncomfortable truth beneath the comedy. They didn't behave like television families who conveniently learned a life lesson at the end of every episode. They behaved like people who had accumulated history. They knew exactly which buttons to push. Peg knew how to irritate Al. Al knew how to embarrass Peg. Kelly knew exactly how to manipulate her father, but knew how to exploit Al's insecurities. And somehow, despite all of it, they remained a family. The show did not need to explain that relationship every week. It simply existed. And O'Neill's performance made that believable. One of the most recognizable things about Al Bundy wasn't actually a line. It was the way he moved. The shoulders, the posture, the tired walk. the expression of a man who seemed to have personally lost an argument with the universe before breakfast. The Television Academy specifically has an interview segment devoted to O'Neill discussing Al Bundy's walk and stance. That matters because O'Neill didn't build Al exclusively through dialogue. He built him physically. Before Al even spoke, the audience could often tell how he felt. If he entered a room slowly, shoulders lowered, viewers already knew something had gone wrong. If he stood with that familiar posture and stared at someone without speaking, the audience anticipated the insult. If he walked into the house after work, the body language itself became a punchline. It was an actor creating a character from the outside in. And over time, that physicality became inseparable from Al Bundy. The interesting part is that O'Neill later acknowledged that there were similarities between himself and Al. The Television Academy archive includes a discussion specifically about how O'Neill was like his character. That doesn't mean Ed O'Neill was Al Bundy. It means the performance contained enough of the actor's own observations about life to make the character feel authentic. That's why Al never felt completely artificial. He felt lived in. This is where many viewers misunderstood Married with Children. Traditional sitcoms often built episodes around a problem that could be solved. Someone made a mistake. Someone learned a lesson. The family came together. The conflict disappeared. The audience went home satisfied. Married with Children often did something completely different. The problem didn't have to disappear. Sometimes it got worse. Sometimes Al lost. Sometimes Peg won. Sometimes everybody lost. And the next week, they were right back where they started. That repetitive frustration was part of the show's philosophy. Life doesn't always give you a satisfying ending. Bills return. Jobs remain difficult. Marriage requires work. Children continue growing. Dreams don't always happen. And people don't magically become better versions of themselves because 30 minutes have passed. Al Bundy represented that reality in exaggerated form. He was funny because he was trapped. But the audience could laugh because, underneath the exaggeration, they recognized something familiar. Calling Al Bundy a loser is easy. Calling him a failure is even easier. But that misses something essential about the character. Al had achieved something. He had survived. He had a family. He had a home. He had held the same kind of job for years. He had endured disappointment after disappointment and still returned the next morning. That doesn't necessarily make someone successful in the conventional sense, but it does make him resilient. O'Neill understood that Al needed to remain human. If Al became completely cruel, the audience would stop caring. If he became completely stupid, the character would lose his dignity. If he became too sentimental, the entire premise would collapse. The trick was balancing all three. Al could be selfish. He could be insensitive. He could be crude. But he could also be protective. He could occasionally surprise everyone with loyalty. And when the family was genuinely threatened, Al often showed that beneath all the complaining was someone who cared deeply. That contradiction made the character work. When Married with Children premiered in 1987, it became the first primetime series broadcast by the Fox network. The Television Academy records the show's programming history beginning in April 1987. That context is essential. Fox was not yet the television giant it would eventually become. It was the newcomer. And Married with Children was unlike the polished family sitcoms that dominated traditional network television. The Bundys were deliberately messy. The humor was deliberately uncomfortable. The characters were not trying to impress anyone. And Al Bundy was certainly not trying to become a role model. In fact, the show seemed to ask the audience a strange question. What if the television father wasn't the smartest man in the room? What if he wasn't financially successful? What if his children didn't automatically respect him? What if his wife didn't constantly admire him? What if marriage wasn't presented as a permanent romantic honeymoon? That was revolutionary in its own strange way. The show didn't ask viewers to admire the Bundys. It asked them to recognize them. Then came the controversy. In January 1989, Michigan viewer Terry Ricalta watched an episode of Married with Children and became deeply offended by its sexual humor and imagery. She began a campaign targeting the show's advertisers. Contemporary reporting from Time and the Los Angeles Times documents the resulting advertiser withdrawals and the national controversy. Several major advertisers reconsidered or pulled commercials. The controversy became national news. And suddenly, a sitcom that had been making jokes about dysfunctional family life was being discussed as a cultural problem. For Fox, this could have been disastrous. But something unexpected happened. People became curious. The controversy itself generated attention. A Los Angeles Times report from March 1989 noted that the show reached its highest ratings for a Fox series during the controversy. That is one of television history's great ironies. The attempt to suppress attention helped create more attention. People who had never watched the show wanted to know what was supposedly so outrageous. They tuned in, and many stayed. The controversy helped transform Married, with Children from a provocative sitcom into a cultural phenomenon. For the audience, the controversy was entertainment. For the people making the show, it was uncertainty. Every joke suddenly had consequences. Every advertiser mattered. Every complaint could become a headline. And every headline could become another reason for executives to worry. The Television Academy's interview archive specifically includes O'Neill discussing censorship issues and the Terry Recalta campaign. What makes that interesting is that O'Neill wasn't simply playing a character in a comedy anymore. He was one of the faces of a show involved in a debate about what television was allowed to say. And Al Bundy became an unlikely symbol of that debate. That wasn't necessarily the original plan. But once a character becomes culturally recognizable, people begin assigning meanings to him. Some saw Al as offensive. Others saw him as satire. Some saw him as a representation of working-class frustration. Others saw him as an intentionally exaggerated example of what not to become. The truth was probably somewhere in between. Al was never designed to deliver a political manifesto. He was designed to make people laugh. But the things people laughed at revealed what made them uncomfortable. Even the controversy wouldn't have mattered if the cast didn't work. The Bundys had to feel like a family. And that meant chemistry. Katie Seagal's Peggy was not merely Al's wife. She was his opponent. She understood exactly how to defeat him. Al might control the television. Peg could control the conversation. Christina Applegate's Kelly brought another dimension to the household. Kelly was beautiful, confident, and often hilariously unaware of her own limitations. Bud, meanwhile, desperately wanted to escape the shadow of his father and become successful with women, money, and popularity. The four characters created a constant comic ecosystem. Nobody was completely innocent. Nobody was completely guilty. Everybody had an agenda, and Ed O'Neill stood in the center of that chaos. Another detail fans sometimes forget is that the show was performed in front of a live audience. The Television Academy archive includes O'Neill discussing the show's typical work week and shooting in front of a live audience. That meant the laughter wasn't merely added later as decoration. The actors were performing comedy and receiving immediate feedback. A joke could explode. A joke could die. A pause could become funnier than the line. A reaction from the audience could alter the rhythm of an entire scene. For an actor like O'Neill, that created a unique challenge. Al's humor often depended on timing. The audience had to believe that Al was tired of everything before the punchline even arrived. Sometimes the funniest thing wasn't what Al said. It was how long he waited before saying it. That silence became part of the character. This is where things became complicated. Ed O'Neill created Al Bundy. But eventually, Al Bundy became a cultural identity of his own. People shouted Al's name, Ed O'Neill. Fans recognized him everywhere. Merchandise used the character. Promotional material used the character. The Television Academy archive even includes O'Neill discussing having his image associated with Married, with Children merchandise and promotions. For many actors, fame is the dream. But character fame can be strange. The public doesn't necessarily know you. They know the person you played. And Al Bundy was so distinctive that the boundary could become difficult to escape. Imagine spending years building an acting career, only to have millions of people associate you with one pair of shoes, one couch, one house, and one sarcastic voice. O'Neill didn't necessarily resent it, but he understood what it meant. Al Bundy was going to follow him. One of the most important relationships on the show was the one between O'Neill and Katie Seagal. Their characters fought constantly, but their performances worked because there was trust underneath the hostility. The Television Academy includes O'Neill specifically discussing working with Seagal as Peg Bundy. That distinction is important. Actors can play people who hate each other without actually hating each other. In fact, comedy often requires the opposite. The performers need to trust each other's timing completely. One actor has to know that the other will pause at exactly the right moment. A look has to land. A reaction has to be precise. A physical gag has to be safe. And the actors have to be willing to make each other look ridiculous. That's why the Bundy marriage worked. Al and Peg could insult one another endlessly because the actors knew exactly where the comic boundaries were. Perhaps the biggest misconception about Al Bundy was that he hated his family. He complained about them constantly. He dreamed about escape. He hated spending money. He blamed Peg for nearly everything. He was embarrassed by Kelly. He argued with Bud. Yet the character kept returning. He never actually abandoned them. That was the contradiction. Al's complaints were often expressions of frustration rather than evidence that he felt nothing. And that is something O'Neill's performance communicated without needing to explain it. If Al truly hated the Bundys, the show wouldn't have lasted. The audience wouldn't have cared. Instead, viewers understood something more complicated. You can complain about your family and still love them. You can be exhausted by people and still need them. You can fantasize about another life while being deeply attached to the one you actually have. That is a very human contradiction. Modern television often asks audiences to root for characters. Al didn't need that. He could be petty. He could be ridiculous. He could make terrible decisions. And sometimes the audience laughed precisely because he was wrong. That gave the character freedom. The show didn't have to protect him. It could let him lose. It could make him look foolish. It could expose his insecurity. And because O'Neill never seemed desperate to make Al likable, the character became more believable. He wasn't trying to win the audience. He was trying to survive the Bundy household. That was funnier. By the 1990s, Married, with Children was no longer simply a strange new sitcom. It was established. It had survived controversy. It had survived changes in television. It had survived the evolving careers of its cast. And it had become one of Fox's signature shows. But television success changes the economics of a production. Cast salaries rise. Production expenses increase. Audience expectations change. Networks begin looking at ratings differently.